Russian military archives have revealed previously unpublished documents that challenge well-established narratives about World War II. We know that from 1941 to 1945, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union were fighting Nazis side by side, and this is how this went down in history. But according to the newly unveiled files, that anti-Hitler coalition was not initially in the cards. In fact, France and Britain had planning to attack the Soviet Union before it was attacked by Germany. Well, this is quite interesting. So this is a copy of a note by Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces at the beginning of World War II. And it outlines how the Allies wanted to strike southern Caucasus in what is modern-day Azerbaijan. This former Soviet region still has vast oil resources and played a significant role in country's ability to wage war. The date on the document suggests that the French military had such plans in February of 1940, 3 months before Hitler invades France and a little over a year before he takes on the USSR. The note was discovered by the Soviets in post-war Germany, along with other documents that Nazis themselves had captured in occupied France. It says that the French military command considered not just bombing Soviet oil fields, but also inciting Muslims living in the region to revolt against Moscow. We were allies in World War II, weren't we? How did all that come to be?
Before we became allies, a lot had happened in Europe, a lot of rather controversial things, when each country pursued its own goals.
This is a photo taken around the time that Allied powers planned to launch an attack on the Soviet Union. It shows British military pilots boarding an airplane in Syria from where airstrikes were supposed to have been carried out. And according to this cable, signed by the head of the Soviet NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, Moscow was well aware of the buildup in the Middle East.
The French intelligence service actively seeking detailed information regarding the topography of the area, condition of the roads, and natural obstacles in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. French intelligence is particularly interested in intelligence on regions that border Iran.
What does it mean? Did they plan a ground invasion of the USSR's Caucasus from Iran too?
They expected Iran and Turkey to help them.
The only reason these plans weren't put into action, says archive director Vladimir Tarasov, was that Hitler invaded France and the Allies all of a sudden had a more urgent problem on their hands. In 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Nazi Germany's foreign minister, arrived in Moscow to sign a controversial non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. His plane landed at what used to be a major airport of the Soviet capital back then, and now they turned the place into a park. Because of that pact that brought Stalin and Hitler somewhat closer for a short period of time, France and the UK started to deem the USSR as their potential enemy and even considered waging war on the country. Well, not everyone knows, though, that before striking a deal with Berlin, Moscow was actively seeking a military alliance with London and Paris. But those suggestions fell on deaf ears. This is a declassified proposal to Britain and France by the Soviet Union. It's dated April 17, 1939, 4 months before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Accord between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany came into being.
Britain, France and the USSR signing an agreement for 5 to 10 years, pledging themselves to immediately assist each other by any means necessary, including militarily, in the event of aggression in Europe against any of the parties to that agreement.
If Britain, France and the Soviet Union had signed the proposal at the time, a full-fledged anti-Hitler coalition would have been formed much earlier. But animosity was running high.
Britain and France's leadership were in no haste to change their policy towards the USSR. Of course, they were wary of the Soviet Union, its social and political system. Naturally, their goal was to divert the German military machine towards the east and direct it against the Soviet Union.
The fact is, neither Britain nor France wanted to be the first to go to war with Hitler. In 1938, trying to at least postpone the large-scale conflict, the Allies even held the infamous Munich Conference, which allowed Nazi Germany to occupy Czechoslovakia. In exchange, Neville Chamberlain, Britain's prime minister at the time, brought back home a non-aggression pact between Britain and Germany, a document similar to one signed between Germany and the USSR a year later. Chamberlain proudly brandished the pact, which bore Hitler's signature. Some modern historians like to point out that Hitler and Stalin had struck a deal, and therefore the Soviet leader was, in their opinion, equally responsible for starting the war. However, Moscow was not the first power to negotiate with Berlin in the late 1930s.
People like to pick and choose historical facts that they like, and nobody wants to talk about uncomfortable things.
Britain and France's desire to appease Germany on one hand, and their reluctance to negotiate with the USSR on the other, led Moscow's leadership into believing that the USSR could be Hitler's next target. That's when Joseph Stalin and his close inner circle locked themselves inside his country residence with a map of Europe. I guess this is one of the most important exhibits at your museum. We should probably be careful with it.
It will be one of the most interesting things at the exhibition.
A map of Europe from the 1930s containing notes by Stalin is on public display for the first time. It shows the Soviet leader's vision of what the USSR security zone should look like. So everything that's colored blue and red is...
This is Stalin.
Did he write it himself?
Yes, absolutely. Here, using a red pencil, he marked Central Europe, Mitteleuropa as they called it. So basically, it was Germany's sphere of interest.
But it's not just Germany, it's also Austria, Czechoslovakia.
At that point, Germany had already absorbed Czechoslovakia.
The Soviet security zone included territories that had been part of the Russian Empire for centuries and were recently lost during the Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War. These were the Baltic states, Western Belarus and Ukraine controlled by Poland, the region of Bessarabia controlled by Romania, and the region of Karelia close to the city of Leningrad. Some historians will look at this map and say, here's how Stalin and Hitler planned to divide Europe, therefore they are to blame for World War II.
Stalin was no shrinking violet. He was concerned about the geopolitical situation near the USSR's borders, and he wanted these regions secure.
As the Russian historians claim, the Soviet leadership didn't want to incorporate the Baltic states initially, but had to change their mind when they saw growing sympathy between political elites in those countries and Nazi Germany. A Soviet secret agent in Lithuania sent this cable to Moscow after clandestinely attending a meeting where one of the members of a local nationalistic party was reading an unofficial message from Germany's foreign ministry.
Germany wants to change the system in the Baltic states and turn them into the United States, where Lithuania would be the main player due to its geographical closeness to Germany and good relations between the two countries.
Before long, in the summer of 1940, Lithuania and the two other Baltic states had become part of the Soviet Union. So we're gonna need white gloves to work with these documents.
Yes, these are unique documents.
This is an original declaration from 1940, where the recently installed Lithuanian government formally asks for the republic to be accepted into the Soviet Union. Similar documents were submitted by Latvia and Estonia and became legal grounds for their inclusion. Current officials in those nations denounce it as an occupation, but back then it was internationally recognized and saw no objections either from Berlin or from London and Paris. Why did Moscow need these three Baltic states as part of the Soviet Union?
First and foremost, for the security of the country, so it can stand against Germany's potential aggression.
If there had been no Soviet troops, the German army would have been standing there. Would it have been good for the Baltic countries or not? Well, that certainly would not have been good for the Soviet Union.
While in the Baltic states the Soviets received a lukewarm welcome, in western Belarus and Ukraine, which Poland had captured from Russia just 2 decades before, local population were much more enthusiastic.
We have a lot of evidence. We have photos and video footage that show that the locals welcomed the Red Army as liberators.
How much of it is just Soviet propaganda?
You see, historically, Poland never had some of the lands it had then. It got them as a result of the Polish-Soviet War. These territories were ceded to Poland in accordance with the Peace of Riga. The locals, Ukrainians and Belarusians didn't do well out of that.
As the Red Army took control of western Belarus and Ukraine, and the German military seized western Polish provinces, Poland lost its sovereignty. In response to the Germans' aggression, Britain and France, which had guaranteed Poland's independence, finally declared war on Hitler, but did little to actually help their embattled ally. There are captured photographs in Russia's archives showing British and French soldiers hanging out in Paris cafes and playing football in the rear at the same time as Nazi troops were invading Poland. This was later called the Phony War.
It became clear that Poland was disintegrated, and the Polish army was only half capable. It was surrounded, the Germans were laying siege to Warsaw, and in 24 hours it would be over for Poland. At a military council, the Allies made the decision to stop all offensive operations. These are real facts, and you can make your own conclusions. It seems they didn't really want to fight.
For Moscow, this became yet another signal that the Allies couldn't be trusted, and the Soviet Union should further secure its eastern front before a looming war with Nazi Germany. But unlike in Poland and the Baltics, in Finland, Moscow faced stubborn resistance. The Finns refused to move their border away from Leningrad, Russia's second-largest city. This resulted in a Soviet-Finnish war in late 1939.
This is the map that had been drawn by the Red Army General Staff upon agreement with the Finnish side. Here is the signature of Marshal Shapshnikov, dated October 12, 1939.
Another authentic map from that period, which is appearing on public display for the first time, shows Soviet proposals for swapping territories with Finland. Moscow had been ready to give a large chunk of its land in exchange for a buffer in front of its second capital, and therefore settle the issue without going to an unnecessary war with its northwestern neighbor. Why the Finns didn't go for it?
They showed attitude. Later, in post-war Finland, a committee was formed to review those issues, and its conclusion was that they should have agreed.
As a result of the following war with the USSR, Finland lost much more territory than Moscow had initially asked for. Of course, the Soviet-Finnish conflict, the division of Poland and its betrayal by the Allies, the appeasement policy and the secret talks with Nazi Germany, none of this looks good for any country in the run-up to the war. This was a tough time, and there were hardly any good choices available. And thanks to these archive documents, we can still separate the truth from the misconceptions.